If doctors told us that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, we would rejoice. We'd feel hope that we could live our lives again, get back to work, back to doing what we want. Well, masks are a ticket to that freedom. We can help protect others and save lives by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Until there's a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on. A message to help keep you safe.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
And one thing I remember in reading about you as a kid, you were among the first of the prominent baseball stars who kind of agitated for integrating the game. You had seen these players in barnstorming games and whatnot, and you felt it was an injustice.
One of the things that I really am kind of proud of myself about is that in my induction in the Hall of Fame, nobody encouraged me on this. I thought this thing alone, and I thought I'd seen Satchel Paige, and I'd seen Josh Gibson, and I'd heard about Buck Leonard, and I'd heard about some of the other great black athletes. And it just came out that day that I wrote in my speech that I hope someday that the great black players of the past, who only because of their color never had a chance to play in the big leagues, and it hit a little note. And the very next year, they come out with a, I got to say, half-assed program for the black players to get into the Hall of Fame. And finally, they changed that to full authenticity of the merits of these guys.
Yeah.
To be in baseball's Hall of Fame, and so it was, I think, a very important move.
They had made a separate wing.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, Jackie Robinson and those who followed, full-fledged Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
But some of the guys from before in the Negro Leagues, a separate wing, and now they've fully included them.
Yeah.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, now, here we go again. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and it is Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast that each and every week strains to go into the realm of what used to be in professional sports. We leave no stone unturned. We've got a ton of stories to get to, and it's endlessly fascinating, as this week hopefully will be, especially for you baseball fans and those of the Negro Leagues, the proverbial gift that keeps on giving for this little show for sure. So many great stories, so many great teams, so many great players, frankly, a whole ton of them quite unheralded. And that's kind of sort of the focus of this week's conversation with our guest this week, Stephen Greenis, as we talk about the Hall of Fame relative to the Negro Leagues. And frankly, there's a lot of work to do, friends. There's so many great players, managers, administrators, et cetera, of the Negro Leagues that, for whatever reasons, are still not part of the hallowed hall. The pinnacle, not only of baseball, it is said, and its history, but frankly, of perhaps of all of sports, probably the quintessential Hall of Fame, maybe the blueprint for halls of fame everywhere in Cooperstown. We get into a fascinating and frankly a well-deserved conversation with Stephen about his new book. It's called Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame: The Case for Inducting 24 Overlooked Ball Players. It's published by our pals at McFarland. But it's not just 24 players. It's actually a couple of dozen others that are also worthy of merit. It is a tremendously well-researched and a well-written book that makes the case not only for these individuals, as we'll get into a few of them in our conversation, but also just the general issue of Negro Leagues in general not being fully accorded their due, if you will, in baseball's highest shrine. There's no doubt there's some debate, of course, about various players and the lack of statistics and the relative ragtagness, or at least some of the structure of Negro League baseball, certainly not all of it, but all kinds of excuses, frankly, in politics around perhaps why Negro League inhabitants still, to this day, have not sort of gotten their equal due, I would argue. And you could make the case that this year, 2020, being, for a whole bunch of different reasons, right, almost an exquisite time to not only address this issue, but perhaps to once and for all sort of make things right and more regular and more structured, shall we say, in terms of how to not only include more Negro League players and managers and administrators, but creating more of a regular and understood structure to evaluate and to bring them into inclusion. It's a very interesting conversation. The book is fascinating for sure. That clip that you just heard at the beginning here, though, really does set the tone and is actually kind of almost the starting point for our conversation with Stephen in a few moments. That was Ted Williams, interviewed by Bob Costas for his, a tremendous show and frankly underrated. It was called Later with Bob Costas. It was a half-hour show that picked up where the Late Night with David Letterman show left off. If you were on the East Coast like I was as a kid, that meant 1:35 a.m. to 2:05 a.m. if you were still up. But you were generally well rewarded with fascinating and excellently researched conversation. And Costas is a good conversationalist for sure, and an interviewer. And this was part of a two-parter with Ted Williams. This was June 14th, 1993, to be exact. We think this is the first part of that two-parter. And Williams is referring to not only his adamant stance for much of his life, certainly after, as a player for sure, but certainly after it too, when he had more of a megaphone to sort of make this cause about the lack of inclusion of some of the greatest players who ever played the game. Just happened to be black, happened to play in the Negro Leagues, right? Not their fault, not through no issues of their own. Were some of the best players, not only of their time and in the Negro Leagues, but of all time and of baseball generally. Williams is referring to his Hall of Fame induction speech in 1966, where he specifically and relatively boldly called out the Hall of Fame for not including more of the, shall we call them, not so obvious players from the Negro Leagues era. I mean, Jackie Robinson is obvious, right? And he played for a year or two in the Negro Leagues himself, and Satchel Paige, obvious. But as we talked about with our pal Don Rogeson a few weeks back, a lot of players and a lot of folks around the game, administrators and managers and others who, broadcasters even, frankly, in certain circles, writers, you could make the argument too, for sure, that have been overlooked. And we'll get into our conversation not only of some of the people and the players and some of the names that have been overlooked and the causes for perhaps their inclusion in the Hall of Fame, but also, frankly, the, shall we say, inelegant and prickly history of how the Hall of Fame has, or frankly hasn't, warmly and equally embraced the Negro Leagues, even still to this day. Yeah, some things have happened since Ted Williams' speech in 66, and a number of different efforts have been made, some of them noble, some of them worthy, but frankly, some of them also kind of still smacking of tokenism, if you really think about it. And as our conversation with Stephen Greenis we'll get into, there's just a wealth of people that deserve a structured and meticulous evaluation to be fully included into the Hall of Fame. And we'll get into some of those names, some of those situations, but we also get into the prelude of that, which is why the Hall of Fame hasn't been, shall we say, a bit more progressive and a bit more eager, shall we say, to more warmly and equally embrace those of the Negro Leagues. Yeah, I think things are getting a little bit better, but again, I think in this moment in time, it's timely to have this conversation and get really into the specifics. And yeah, this is a little bit of saber nerdism and we debate statistics and all that kind of stuff, but those are just sideshows to the bigger issue of Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame. That's the topic of our conversation this week with Stephen Greenis. It is multifaceted and interesting, to say the least. Before we get there, we want to, of course, encourage you to partake of the wares of at least one of our sponsors. And this week, let's spin the dial to our pals at 503 Sports, 503-sports.com, the king of throwbacks. It's Dustin Alameda and his pals in Portland, Oregon. And of course, it neatly fits into this week's topic. Dustin and his friends have refreshed the site even more and added more inventory. And there is a great and now expanded section devoted to the Negro Leagues. And yes, there were a number of major leagues, and certainly there were a bunch of minor leagues too, that sort of were in the under the umbrella of the Negro Leagues. But we're talking about, say, the Negro National League or the Negro American League, the one-year wonder that was the East-West League, even the Eastern Colored League, et cetera. There are a handful of other major leagues under the rubric, I guess, of the Negro Leagues, and a lot of them brought some great teams into the mix, and a lot of those are lovingly remembered in ball caps and in customized jerseys, and even in T-shirt form at 503 Sports. That's 503-sports.com. And we're talking about some of the greatest names in the Negro Leagues and in baseball history: the Kansas City Monarchs, the Birmingham Black Barons, the Indianapolis Clowns, who we hope to do a specific episode on in the near future, the Homestead Grays, of course, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, the Detroit Stars, on and on and on. These are amazing. The Baltimore Black Sox, they are fitted hats. There are customized jerseys. There are T-shirts. They're all there for you and more. A great selection, a great collection, and more to come, I'm certain, at 503-sports.com. And of course, when you find something that you like, please indeed use the promo code that we've got for you there. That's SEATS. The promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. So please, the holidays are, believe it or not, virtually around the corner. What a great opportunity to get your orders in now, ensure that they get delivered, pad in that time for all the shipping that's going to be delayed, and indeed get yourself and your friends and your relatives, all those in your life who are big baseball fans or Negro League fans, a great opportunity and a great excuse. 503 Sports, again, it's 503-sports.com. And use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases, not just the great Negro League collection, but all the great stuff in the realm of forgotten sports. And we thank Dustin for his support of the show, and we thank you for your listening to the show this week. Here's our conversation coming right up. Here's Stephen Greenis and me talking about the Negro Leagues and the Hall of Fame. Who should be in? Who's been forgotten? And what can we do to rectify it? And here's our chat. Please enjoy. To help our audience better understand sort of the framing of all this, and where do you come to the Negro Leagues generally anyway, just as from your interest and your background? You're not a professional baseball person per se. I want to give our audience a bit of a sense of how you got hooked on baseball in the first place and the Negro League story specifically.
Well, the first game I ever attended, and I say this in my book, was coincidentally Don Larson's perfect game.
Which I think is
7 years old.
Right there is fascinating, right? If that doesn't send a signal to anybody, I mean, nothing will, right?
That's right. I still have the ticket stub from that game, believe it or not. But it's, I grew up in the New York metropolitan area, so baseball was our second religion in the 1950s. And I've been hooked ever since. I was the kind of person who collected baseball cards meticulously. I kept them in good condition, and I'm one of the few people whose mother never threw away his collection. I still have my cards from the late 50s and early 60s. Now,
but your dad was a Yankee fan, right? And that wasn't necessarily your story growing up as you went around, right?
That's correct. I was a bit of a contrarian, so I adopted the New York Giants and Willie Mays as my team and favorite player. And I stayed with them for about 10 years when they went to the West Coast. But then, I came back because I'm still a New Yorker.
Well, all right, but the Giants, right, of all the three teams at that time, you could argue were probably the third of the three maybe worthy of being chosen, I guess, for your fandom, no?
I think that's true. A neighbor had taken me to a Giant game, and for whatever reason, I just became attached.
So, all right, well, then how does that manifest then into, I mean, obviously you're going to games and you're becoming aware of sort of the dynamics, I guess, of the three teams and then ultimately one team, or at least for a period of time. How does it sort of manifest into just more than going to games on an occasion and saving a few programs and some ticket stubs?
Yeah, as I grew older, I really developed an interest in statistics and the history of baseball, and I was particularly interested in Jackie Robinson and the integration of baseball. And I came to realize that, Jackie Robinson had to come from somewhere. He didn't materialize out of the air. And as I studied the Negro Leagues, particularly after Robert Peterson's book in the early 70s, Only the Ball Was White, I began to see that there were many Jackie Robinsons. Robinson was just the tip of the iceberg. And as I studied it more and more, I began to feel that these men really were short-sighted, were short-changed by the Hall of Fame, which was another interest of mine in terms of, who they admitted and how they were admitted.
Yeah, well, no doubt. I've got a copy of Peterson's book right here, and we had Don Rogeson on a couple of weeks back, who arguably wrote sort of the second, I have already argued, this seminal sort of entry-level, I guess, introduction into the Negro Leagues, and in particular the plight of the players, right? And indeed, it was interesting is the wrong word, right? But an existence professionally as well as just societally, right? An interesting and curious time in the sport of baseball where you had sort of this parallel sort of world, and I think really what it brings up is not just the Jackie Robinson story, right? Important and seminal as it was, right, for various reasons. In some respects, almost like the tip of the iceberg, because for every Jackie Robinson and other players that followed with that barrier being broken, you had just a wellspring of talent that, I think upon the decades as they pile on, becomes a very interesting conversation around quality of play, professionalism, not only and their stories, but also their qualifications, so to speak, as being equal, if not superior, to their white organized baseball counterparts.
I think that's very true. The Negro Leagues, however you define them, and I define them very liberally in my book, go back to 1878, and they run right through 1949. Veteran catcher Joe Green of the Negro Leagues always said the Negro Leagues were the real major leagues. And he believed it strongly because he had played in many barnstorming games where they played against white major leaguers. I really believe that these guys were great, great players, and that their time, if they had been given a chance, they really would have stood out. I mean, imagine, for example, the NFL or the NBA without African Americans, and you have a snapshot of what was going on at the time. There was tremendous talent, and probably in many ways superior to the talent in a lot of white Major League Baseball at the time.
All right, so how do you back into this story, growing up watching, the top tier and arguably some of the top teams in Major League Baseball, quote unquote? I doubt you took in or were alive or around or when it was vibrant. You actually went to any of the Negro League games. By the way, many in the same very stadiums that you were probably going to games to, right? How do you backtrack, I guess, into this story and then try to go deeper into it?
Well, it's, one of the things I really feel I missed in my life was the chance to attend some Negro League games. I was far too young, because the truth is the Negro Leagues as a really vibrant, high-end organization were over by 1950, because once Jackie Robinson entered the major leagues, even African Americans lost interest in the Negro Leagues. And after that, they were, maybe low minor league baseball at best, and they faded out by the early 60s. But, as I did my research, some facts really jumped out at me. For example, you know that the National League integrated before the American League. Are you aware that 9 of the 11 MVPs in the National League between 1947 and 1959 were former Negro Leaguers?
So that's interesting.
I mean, that's a stunning fact.
Well, it's not only stunning; it's
almost dispositive as to the quality of the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, and so it also brings up the question: is like, we can sort of get into some of that here now if you want, but like the proverbial what took so long, right? This just taking all the other sort of distracting issues aside, just from a pure talent perspective, right? It just seems, I guess, through the frame of history, so illogical.
Well, racism is illogical, and that was clearly the answer. I mean, many teams thought about integrating earlier than 1947. I think in 1943, the Pittsburgh Pirates had a tryout scheduled with 3 of the top players in the Negro Leagues, and at the last minute, the Pirates lost their nerve and backed out. There were chances, but nobody really had the guts to go through with this until, the Dodgers did it in 1947.
So from your perspective then, it's clear that, there were differing levels of Negro League play, right, over that period of time that you just discussed, right? And there's no doubt that some of the top tier of those, right, whether it be the Negro National League or the Negro American League, even the East-West League for a year or two. I mean, we can get into sort of there's almost a grading, if you will, of certain leagues within sort of this bigger umbrella of the Negro Leagues. But I guess the question in there somewhere is, as you're getting involved in sort of investigating this stuff further, where do you focus most of your energies to kind of even get to where the best players and the best teams were sort of sitting? It probably wasn't all that obvious, or was it?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is to understand that the Negro Leagues were not an exact equivalent to the American and National League. They operated differently. I view them as a multiverse, that they had many levels of high-level play. Not only did they have the official Negro Leagues operating in the United States, the ones you've just mentioned, Negro National League, the Negro American League, the Negro Southern League for 1 year. They were basically any high-level league that allowed dark-skinned players to play baseball. And they operated not only in the United States, but throughout the Caribbean. Cuban ball was played at a very high level during the 20s, 30s. There were South American winter leagues that the players gravitated to. There were barnstorming teams that were some of the greatest teams of all time that operated independent of any league, but they played black and white teams at all levels. This was also a time in America when there were strong industrial and local league teams that were all over the place. There was the California Winter League, which integrated in the 1920s and allowed Negro League teams to play as a unit, not as a part of other teams, but as a unit. And in the California Winter League, black teams won 60% of the games they played, and they won 13 of the 16 pennants between 1924 and 1939. There were also elite military teams who, prior to 1920, where some of the greatest black ball players were part of those teams. They went throughout the country playing independent teams and beating everybody. So the Negro Leagues were all of these things, and there were great players at all of these levels.
Yeah, maybe you can also describe a little bit about the sort of I hesitate to use the word infrastructure, right? Because I think in some cases, I mean, obviously Rube Foster, very, very integral in getting sort of, I guess, as close to a mimicking of organized baseball in terms of structure and scheduling and all that kind of stuff. But you're hinting at that there's also, in this multiverse you're describing, some things that are not necessarily as set in stone or regimented or great attention to detail, statistics, for example, right? Which we'll stumble into as a particular thorny issue as the years rolled on. A bit of a sense of sort of the officialness, I guess, of Negro League baseball. I guess there were branches of it that were absolutely that, but clearly others that were not necessarily.
Right. The official Negro League baseball was started by Rube Foster in 1920. And he founded the Negro National League, which ran through about 1931 and then fell apart. Then there was the East-West League that operated, as you pointed out, for 1 year. And then a guy named Gus Greenlee, who was a bootlegger and a numbers runner from Pittsburgh, created the Negro National League, which operated from 1933 to 1948. And there was also a Negro American League that started in 1937 and ran through the end of Negro League history in about 1960. But, as I pointed out, even these official leagues, as they were operating, usually there were no more than 2 or 3 league games per week. And the rest of the week was filled up with independent play against independent teams. And usually at a fairly decent level. And that was really the Negro League world. It was different than the American and the National League world. There was also some crossover. After the end of the season, there was significant barnstorming between, white major leaguers and Negro League teams because that's what the public wanted to see. And those Negro League teams won, historians differ by exactly what the percentage was, but Negro League teams won over 50% of those games. And you could say, well, hey, they were exhibition games. Nobody really cared. But that you wouldn't understand what was really going on. The African Americans were trying to win. They wanted to make a point. And the white major leaguers didn't want to be shown up.
Yeah, and it's almost like a double-edged sword, right? Because it's in a very intriguing way, right? And we've talked on a number of different episodes about sort of the businessmen behind, or in case of Manley, businesswomen behind, the business, if you will, of this, of the existence of the African American pursuit of baseball. Right, there is this sort of the official league kind of play thing, but the bigger bucks were probably being made on the side, if you will, or maybe not on the side, but almost more centrally. It was important to have the barnstorming and the competitive against the white teams or whatever, because it generated revenue and or was arguably more entertaining, right? It was more of a show, more of an attraction for people to come and pay top or greater dollar for. But the other side of that coin, though, right, is perhaps where we skate into some of the framing of your book and the thesis behind it, right, is it didn't help in the realm of, I guess you could call it statistics, right? And maybe arguably helped muddy the waters when it comes to, through an historical lens, the relative quality and assessment of these players, their capabilities, and their qualifications, quote unquote, for, legendary status in something like a Hall of Fame.
Well, I think what you say is true. And in fact, the fact that there were not statistics available for many, many years was used by the Hall of Fame as a way of saying, well, we really can't assess these guys, so we can't really, put them in the Hall of Fame. And the veterans committees, when they looked at the players initially, they would say the same thing. We don't have statistics. How could you, ask us to make a decision? And of course, my point was that the statistics in the official Negro League games are only part of the important, Negro League world. Now, Major League Baseball did something in 2005, which I thought was very good, which was they spent $250,000 having, Negro League historians put together as many official statistics as they could from 1920 through 1947. And then they used that, for the committee of 2006 to review Negro Leaguers, and that committee put 17 new Negro Leaguers into the Hall of Fame.
So, all right, so this unwraps a few other sort of tributaries, I guess, to mix a metaphor, right? So, number one, this gets into how these statistics were sort of kept, so to speak, right? I remember our conversation with Don Rogeson a couple of weeks back. A lot of his sourcing, besides being able to sort of interview, and this is back in 1980 or so, the original imprint of his book, his first book, besides original interviews with actual players and personnel, there was also sort of this very rich, but fairly narrow in terms of number, African American press, right? The Amsterdam News, for example, in New York. You know, the very these are
Pittsburgh Courier.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. So these are arguably the newspapers of record to the extent that they existed in most of these cities for basically this information, these statistics, to the extent that they were kept.
Right. And the historians, when they put those records together in 2005, they went right to the source material, all the newspapers, and they looked up everything they could find. But again, the truth is that not every team reported all of these statistics to the paper on a regular basis, and some of the statistics were wrong, and a lot of the statistics were partial. You know, they didn't have things like stolen bases and defensive records. So they are what they are, and they will always be partial statistics. But I think there's enough out there now in terms of the overall basis of statistical data where one can really look at it all together and say, this guy belongs in the Hall of Fame. And the reason I wrote my book is I feel that the 35 men who are in now, 34 men and 1 woman, are not enough. That there's some really great players who measure up and should be in the Hall of Fame. And the Hall of Fame should reopen their process in a more open way.
All right, I want to get into that sort of checkered sort of history that leads up to your framing and stuff in a second. But it almost feels to me like, and obviously I'm not the Sabre guy. I'm not, this is sort of more of an expansive exploration and personal journey, so to speak, I guess, versus an in-depth sort of baseball statistician kind of approach. But it almost feels to me, if I could really oversimplify some of this, that in some respects, because of the, shall we say, lack of uniformity around statistics and game coverage and all that other stuff, right? It almost feels like it's almost through the historical lens, almost a second version of discrimination in some respects when it comes to the equation of the statistics and the quality of the players when it's thought about in the grand scheme of baseball, right? It's almost like another knock against the stories and the justification, I guess, of some of these players and management.
Well, I think you're getting very close to the truth, because the statement that, well, we don't have statistics, so we can't assess these guys, is basically, racism by not understanding how the Negro Leagues operated. They did not operate, as formal leagues playing 7 games a day, 7, days a week in league games. They operated very differently. And there are other things you can look at. There are enough statistics where you can make judgments as to the quality of players. There's a site online now called Seamheads where they've gathered every statistic they can concerning all these Negro Leaguers. And it's very extensive. It gives you a real solid basis for comparing these players to each other and also to major league players. They have something called Similarity Scores, where they match Negro League players up with major league players based upon their comparative statistics. And some of those, comparisons are amazing. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about players later on. I can tell you about some of those.
Yeah, sure. And we've talked about, obviously, some of those that are already in, like the Oscar Charlestons of the world, right? In some circles, right, argued to be, one of the best baseball players in his position of all, versus not just within the Negro Leagues, right? But I guess before we get into that is, and this is a naive question, and again, I'm not a statistician, but I almost wonder if there's maybe you could tell me if there is such a thing or a methodology. Is there almost like a need for and or an existence of for lack of a better term, a qualitative quotient, so to speak, right? Because you're mentioning all of these barnstorming games, and clearly there are going to be accounts and other historical threads out there beyond statistics of a game that many might have treated as an exhibition anyway. But to deny that play couldn't or shouldn't be part of maybe the overall tableau of a player's existence and or performance, I just wonder if there's any mechanism that could be agreed upon that could sort of layer in some of that, shall we say, non-officialness of their play in those exhibitions and whatnot, since it was such a big part of the Negro League experience.
There's actually a split between Negro historians and how to deal with that. Some, like historian John Holloway, say he wants to count every statistic of every top-level game he could find. And his statement was, if Josh Gibson could hit a home run, I'm going to count it. Other, Negro League historians say, let's stick with this, with the official league games, because that shows us, the most comparative basis for one player to the other. And people look at it differently. My feeling is that you've got to look at all the statistics that are out there, regardless of the forum. I mean, some of these leagues, like the Cuban leagues, very high-level ball, and those statistics are available. The California Winter League, these players were playing against major leaguers and top minor leaguers. I think that's very valuable data, and I think everything should be looked at.
All right, well, describe to me, as you delve deeper into all of this, maybe you can frame for the audience, for those especially not sort of knee-deep in baseball statistics and history and all that kind of stuff, the somewhat tenuous relationship, I guess, between that of the supposedly ultimate shrine of baseball history, that being the Hall of Fame, and the understanding of the Negro Leagues, the inclusion thereof, and maybe some of the timing elements. One of the things that Don Rogeson and I talked about a couple of weeks back was, obviously with the Peterson book and his book, those even preceded what was probably the supernova, I guess, of mainstream understanding of the Negro Leagues, which was the baseball documentary series by Ken Burns, right? That's opened up a lot of doors, and or invented, I guess, or brought back, I guess, the sort of languishing history, or maybe ignored history of what the Negro Leagues was, right? I guess the question is, in your mind, based on what you've been able to discern, how did this sort of admission and or recognition and or I want to call it correction, but a process by which the Hall of Fame started to recognize that they were behind the times, shall we say, in terms of understanding and or incorporating Negro League players and administration?
It's actually a very interesting story, and it kicks off back in 1966 when Ted Williams was making his induction speech at the Hall of Fame, and he used the speech as a basis for arguing loudly and vociferously for the admission of Negro Leaguers. And you kind of say, well, why Ted Williams? And there were a couple of reasons, I think, when you really study the record. First of all, Ted Williams, when he was 12 years old, once saw Satchel Paige pitch a game in San Diego. And Paige pitched a one-hitter, and Williams discerned that the one hit he gave up intentionally to the weakest hitter on the other team. And that really impressed him. When he became a major leaguer himself in the late 30s, he would hear stories about how Josh Gibson, smashed a home run here, he hit a home run there, and he was also impressed by that. And there's one other story that when he faced Satchel Paige himself, when Paige started pitching for the Indians in the late 40s and early 50s, he noticed, because he was a very observant hitter, that every time Satchel Paige threw a curveball, he would twist his wrist at the top of his motion. And, he got up to the bat, and there were 2 strikes on him. He saw Paige twist his wrist, and then a fastball flew by him for strike 3. And the next day he was at the batting cage, and Paige walked over to him and whispered, you should know better than to guess with old Satch. But I think, the real reason that Williams did what he did was people don't understand that he was of Mexican heritage. It was not something he publicized, but it was the fact. And I think he felt like an outsider as well. And he felt it was time to stand up for other outsiders. And that's why he did what he did. That translated into a lot of newspaper writers agitating for the admission of Negro Leaguers to the Hall of Fame. Now, the Hall of Fame was very reluctant. Paul Kerr, who was the president at the time, was very, he really wasn't that interested. But Bowie Kuhn insisted on having a meeting with him. This was about 1971. And he convinced Kerr that it would be a good thing to set up a plaque for Negro Leaguers, not where the main plaques were, but down in a hallway in a separate section. And, Kerr, based upon that, he said, okay, you guys can admit Negro Leaguers, but not as full, Hall of Famers, but down in the hallway. So they put this committee together of about 10 guys, and the first person they elected was Satchel Paige. And when they elected him, as I said, he wasn't supposed to be a full member of the Hall of Fame. Well, the public went crazy. They sent all kinds of letters, which are in the archives of the Hall of Fame. I've read them. They were extraordinary, very, very tough letters saying, you treated him as a second-class citizen during his life, and now you're putting him in the second-class section of the Hall of Fame. And in fact, when Paige flew to New York for his press conference after he had been designated the first recipient, the first Negro League recipient, he didn't know that full membership awaited him. And they told him when he got into the press conference. And so that was the story of the first admission. That committee then admitted, they were allowed the first year to admit one person, then they were told you can only admit 2 a year, and they got up to 9. And then the powers that be at the Hall of Fame said, okay, I think that's enough. That's enough. And Monty Irvin, who was the chair of the committee, was also an employee of Major League Baseball, knew enough to back off. But he also knew there are a lot more men who were qualified than the 9 they had admitted. So then the Hall of Fame turned over the job of electing Negro Leaguers to their Veterans Committee for the next 16 years.
And I'm sorry,
now,
this is about what time, circa what years?
This is 1978 to 1994, the Veterans Committee.
So the 70s largely was sort of this, arguably now beginning phase, but it's now shifting into another gear here in the late 70s.
Right. And so you can imagine there are 18 former players on the Veterans Committee. They put 2 Negro Leaguers on there among the 18. What incentive did these guys who didn't know about the Negro Leagues have to elect, spend 75% of their votes on Negro Leaguers? They elected 2 people over 16 years, one of whom was Rube Foster, who was probably one of the most important figures in Negro League history. So then the Hall of Fame realized this is not working. So they basically gave the Veterans Committee an 8-man ballot and said, you have to put in one person a year for the next 7 years. And so they elected one person a year. They put Buck O'Neill in the committee, and he would tell the other veterans who should be elected. And then about 2001, they said, okay, our ballot's almost out. That's the end of it.
But you describe that in your, I'm sorry, you describe that in your book as almost essentially as a quota type system, yeah?
Well, it was a quota. They were told one person you put in, no more, no less. Just, get this done. And they were basically told who to vote for because they were given a very short ballot. And, the way I look at it is the Hall was dragged kicking and screaming into admitting Negro League members. There was never this type of open voting which was allowed for, the white major leaguers. So finally, in 2005, the Hall of Fame and Major League Baseball authorized this study, which I mentioned before, where they spent $250,000 putting official statistics together for the period 1920 to 1948. They brought a historians committee together, 12 people. They said 75% vote, you get in. They gave them a 35-name ballot, which had been pre-cleared by the Hall of Fame. And they said, you can put in as many as you want from the 35. But again, I interviewed committee members, and they felt there was an implied, obligation not to go too crazy. In effect, I think it's very impressive that they, elected 17 people out of the 35. But, as I say in my book, I think, there was a good case for almost all 35 to be in. They were very, very strong players. There's never been a situation where there was an open and fair ballot over a period of time where people could, build a consensus the way they do when the baseball writers elect members to the Hall of Fame.
So where, and we'll get into some of those overlooked players finally in a moment, but where does it sort of stand today? Is it, I know that there's still some rumblings of trying to make this even more of a, shall we say, a more mainstream inclusionary process.
Well, right now the Hall of Fame has something called era committees. And, initially when they created these era committees, they created one committee which would be for the period 1871 to 1949 for overlooked players. And the philosophy of that committee was we already have too many Hall of Famers from that era. We got to focus more on post-1949 players. And originally that era committee was going to be limited to major league players. The public went a little crazy. And so they said, okay, Negro Leaguers can go into the, early baseball committee, and they can be considered by that committee. The problem is that committee, unlike the other committees, meets only once every 10 years and can only elect 4 people from a 10-person ballot. So effectively, the Negro Leaguers are being given a quota again. It's unlikely that more than 1 or 2 would ever get in every 10 years.
Yeah, but but that also said, right? It's also comparing apples and oranges, so to speak, right? Because you've got a conversation about a dead ball era player, versus a completely different dynamic in that of the Negro Leagues, which itself should be. It seems incongruous, right? When you're talking about turn of the century versus some very dynamic African American baseball play in the 30s,
Exactly right. I mean, the last person admitted by the early era committee, I think, was umpire Hank O'Day. I mean, really, Hank O'Day, compared to some of the players that still are out there in the Negro Leagues, it's to me the only fair solution is to create a new era committee which can look at the Negro Leagues as a whole. Use the same 10-person ballot. You can't elect more than 4 people. All the other era committees meet every 5 years. I think the Negro Leagues, which have not been picked over, should be able to. That era committee should meet every 5 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's just again, from an outsider's perspective, the politics and or just sort of the it still seems so odd that it's still not sort of, I guess, fully sort of figured out. Well, why don't we get into your framing, right? So you've taken great pains, and this book, by the way, is meticulously laid out, and it really makes the case for a whole bunch of these players as to their worthiness, shall we say, for inclusion in the Hall of Fame. But obviously, as these things go, right, you frame it up and obviously make the case in some sort of specific logic. And maybe you want to give our audience a little bit of a general understanding of how you sort of synthesized and came across these players through your own sort of system.
Well, I am a lawyer, so
okay.
My history is writing briefs.
We won't hold that against you. Maybe we should. I don't know.
Okay. But basically what I did was I looked at all of the available statistics, and there are a lot of statistics out there. Most of them are online if you really look for them. I also went back and I looked at player polls, because a lot of the great Negro Leaguers would list their all-time teams, and I thought that was of great significance. Other historians have, picked MVPs and all-stars for every year, even though that wasn't necessarily happening in the Negro Leagues at the time. And those picks were very significant to me, because those are the same type of picks that, major league people look at when they elect people to the Hall of Fame. That, and also another thing that was very important to me was championship teams. You want to pick players who were winners, who were part of a team that won either, a league pennant or a Negro League World Series, because those are players who are very important. And I think once you do that, a certain consensus developed that there were certain players who were clearly, elite players, and every much the equivalent of major Hall of Famers. I'm not talking, the guys who don't belong there, like Lloyd Wainer, who had 26 home runs in his lifetime, but is in the Hall of Fame. I'm talking about the top people.
Well, before we go to some of the names, what teams consistently rose to the top? Because we certainly do know that there was a lot of, player migration to some of the better teams, and as the barnstorming values grew and stuff. But some of them are probably fairly well-known names, but maybe some other team names not so.
Yeah, I focus more on players than teams, but there were some great teams throughout history. The Homestead Grays were one of the best Negro League teams. I would argue that the 1931 Homestead Grays may have been not only the greatest Negro League team, but maybe the greatest baseball team of all time. They had 6 Hall of Famers in that team and a Hall of Fame owner. They had Josh Gibson, Oscar Charleston, Judd Wilson at third, pitcher Smokey Joe Williams, Willie Foster, and Satchel Paige. I mean, they were an extraordinary team. And they also had George Tubby Scales, who's one of the guys I argue should be in the Hall of Fame based upon, available statistics. That team had a record in 1931 of 143 wins, 29 losses, and 2 ties. Just an extraordinary team.
Well, and probably a few barnstorming games in between all of that, too, probably.
Absolutely. League games were only 2 or 3 games a week. The rest of it was barnstorming. The Pittsburgh Crawfords of 1935, an amazing team. Also with 5 Hall of Famers in the lineup, a team that, played at a .785 winning percentage, defeated the New York Cubans in the World Series. These were teams, as you say, players did jump from team to team because the contracts, frankly, were not well respected. In a way, it seemed more like, modern free agencies where players would just go where the dollars were greater. And, the owners really couldn't do anything about it. Satchel Paige was famous for that, jumping from team to team, even in midseason.
What players from all of that immediately stand out as being gross injustices in your mind? You're sort of like your handful of like top folks that like just for whatever reason should be in without any question.
Well, one of my favorites is Dick Cannonball Redding. He pitched from 1911 to 1938. He was a 6'4" fastball pitcher in the dead ball era. Only Smokey Joe Williams and Willie Foster had more wins than him in Negro League history. Only Satchel Paige and Joe Williams had more strikeouts than him in Negro League history. He's including, the type of semi-pro teams they would face on a regular basis. The Center for Negro League Baseball Research has found 346 wins for this guy, and he pitched at a 2.55 ERA. In 1911, he had 17 straight wins for the Philadelphia Giants and the New York Lincoln Giants. Over the course of his career, he completed 91% of the games he started. 22% of his games were shutouts. He's been named the hypothetical Cy Young Award winner by historians 6 different years. There was one exhibition game where he struck out Babe Ruth on 9 consecutive pitches.
Yeah, you also mentioned in his in the write up here that he was particularly effective against various major league opposition too, right? Obviously not for not statistically arguably exhibition oriented, but any chance it seems that he had against quote unquote white competition, he seemed to take and run with.
Absolutely. An interesting sidelight about him was the Yankees hired him when Lou Gehrig was at Columbia to pitch to Lou Gehrig. And I think, facing real major league pitching is what must have helped Lou Gehrig become who he was. But of course, these exhibition games against white teams, sometimes they had other factors as well. In 1927, there was a story about Cannonball Redding where he was facing Babe Ruth's All-Stars in the postseason. And, the promoter came up to him and said, everyone's here to see Babe Ruth hit home runs. And Redding said, okay, gotcha, right down the pike. And that day, Babe Ruth hit 3 monster home runs off Redding. And, the fans went home happy, and Redding and Ruth went home richer. But I think he's the best American pitcher other than the steroids-affected guys like Roger Clemens, who's eligible for the Hall of Fame but not in. I can't understand why he's not in.
Who else can you not understand is not in? And then I want to get sort of the other side of the equation of, people that you discovered that are maybe a little quirky and maybe not on people's radars that you specifically found and discovered and truly are raising the flag for. Okay.
Let me talk to you about Charlie Smith. I played from 1925 to 1931. The players called him Chino. This guy was the Negro League's greatest hitter. He has the highest batting average, Tim, of any player in Major League history, black or white, 388. John Hallway, who counts all games, says he hit 434 against everybody combined. In 1927, he won the batting title, hitting 451. Second in the league in home runs, was the league MVP. 1929, he was the MVP again, hit 464. Led the league also in home runs, runs scored, and outfield assists. He was the MVP again in 1930, hit 492. He played in the first game in Yankee Stadium in July of 1930, hit 2 home runs and a triple and 4 at-bats. He played 5 seasons in Cuba winter ball, has the 4th highest batting average in Cuban winter ball history, 335. 1930, he started feeling sick when he was in Cuba, came back to the U.S., and died in 1931 of stomach cancer. I mentioned before that, this site Seamheads has compared major leaguers to Negro Leaguers. And they say that the 6 players in Major League history, and we're talking about 20,000 players now who've played white Major League ball, the 6 players who are most similar to Chino Smith are in order: Babe Ruth, Ted Williams, Roger Hornsby, Joe DiMaggio, Ty Cobb, and Lou Gehrig.
Should be open and closed case, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not talking about, guys who are, second rate who got passed over. The way the system was run, really great players got missed. Do you think this guy is more important as in baseball history than Hank O'Day?
Well, you also, and we'll get into some of the sort of diamonds in the rough, shall we say, in a minute. But you also extend this into not just players, but also other people related to the game. Like, for example, I was surprised, and again, I'm not as deep into this, as the average Sabre member, right? But to see Gus Greenlee, right, not in there, given what he contributed to the game, it, to me is, and I'm just a layman, if you will, is quite surprising.
I mean, he's one of the Negro League's most dynamic figures. He founded the Negro National League in the early 30s, which was the most successful Negro League of all. He built the first black-owned stadium in 1932, Greenlee Field. He was the first person to install night lights for baseball. He developed and created the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords, which are probably one of the 2 or 3 best teams in Negro League history. And most important of all, he organized and paid the rent for the first East-West All-Star game, which became the calling card for the Negro Leagues. Other than a Joe Louis fight, that was the biggest social event, sporting event in African-American, in society. People came from all over the country for that game, which was usually played in Comiskey Field in Chicago, and it was a big weekend event. And that was all, Gus Greenlee. I mean, how did this guy not get into the Hall of Fame? I don't understand.
Yeah, and it's also, as living in Chicago now, and have learned quite a bit through my family, married family history about the baseball in this city, right? It's also nice to see the great Orestes Mini Minoso in your worthy of further consideration section for third base, right? There are so many other... the one thing that strikes me also, too, besides some of these gross omissions, I guess, is some of the names and the nicknames are just... they should get in...
Extraordinary.
They should get in on those alone. I mean, any names or people that perhaps are, shall we say, undiscovered or less known that you sort of stumbled into and just absolutely will bang the table to make their cases too?
Absolutely, and some of them have great nicknames. There's Oliver the Ghost Marcel. He was a defensive specialist in 1918 to 1930, best fielding third baseman of the 1920s. Other players regarded him with awe. They called him the Ghost because every night he would disappear, and he wouldn't sleep in his bed, and he'd show up at the game the next day. Nobody ever knew where he went. He was teamed with Pop Lloyd, Dobie Moore, and Dick Lundy, three shortstops, with different teams as three of the greatest left-side fielding infields in Negro League history. And the guy could hit. He had a lifetime batting average of .305. In the Cuban League, he hit .393 in 1923 to 1924. He was smart and aggressive on the base paths. He was a real winner. Played for 5 championship teams in the 1920s. The 1952 Courier poll by the Pittsburgh Courier, where they polled, great veterans and executives of the Negro Leagues, named him as the greatest third baseman of all time. Oscar Charleston also thought he was the best third baseman of all time. But unfortunately, he had some other traits, too. He was a real handsome guy. He was vain. He had a very bad temper. He once hit Charleston over the head with a bat. It was Marcel who was with Dave Brown in a bar when Brown killed a man. He actually left baseball after he got into a fight with another guy who has a great nickname, Frank Weasel Warfield. And Warfield bit off his nose in the fight. And he was so disfigured that he couldn't, take it anymore, and he just left the game. He ended up working as a house painter in Denver and died at age 53.
Yeah, some of these stories too, are worthy of at least bringing to the fore, let alone their the background possibly for inclusion into a Hall of Fame.
Well, it's interesting. When I spoke to the voters in the 2006 election for the Hall of Fame, they indicated that they were really concerned with designating people who would reflect the Negro League in their best light. So anyone who had a backstory, that was a little bit off color, like the one about Oliver the Ghost Marcel, seemed to have been skipped over. And I don't think that's right. I think, you've got to deal with people based on the merits of their performance on the field and their contribution to the team, not the fact that they may have had a violent end.
Well, look, and the argument behind that, against that, right, is did anybody look at how baseball got started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the borderline or maybe just fully scoundrel-like qualities of some of these or many of these players? I mean, it just seems incongruous, right?
Well, yes, and we have to accept the fact that these people were living, a rough life in a rough world.
For sure.
And, they were also great, great ball players. And I think many of these teams, for example, the 1931 Homestead Grays, would have beaten white major league teams and all the white major league teams. These were great teams. So
how do we fix this, I guess is the best term, but how does this process improve? Obviously, there's now the Negro League Hall of Fame in Kansas City, which, arguably is the center of all things Negro Leagues, which is, I think, tremendous because it gives everything a center, but it also, in some respects, could be perceived as being, a tributary that maybe takes away from the full inclusion in the quote unquote bigger Hall of Fame or the more mainstream Hall of Fame, right? I guess, how do you sort of see the process and the system evolving, if at all, and perhaps being able to hand out copies of your book and use it as a guidepost, perhaps for finally including or at least reopening the consideration process for a bulk of these players and administrators?
Well, I think the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City is wonderful, but it's a museum. It doesn't really have, a Hall of Fame plaque. It's a place to go and study and really appreciate the Negro Leagues generally. But it's very different than the Hall of Fame. One of the things I ran across in my studies was there was a survey where 70% of Americans said being elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame is the highest honor in American sports. And I think that still rings true. And I think these guys are deserving of the highest honor. And that's why I feel strongly that there should be a separate era committee designated by the Hall of Fame for reviewing these guys on a fair basis. I mean, it's still a very high standard to have to secure 75% of the votes of any committee to be elected to the Hall of Fame. Now, I wrote my book for a purpose. I mean, I want this to happen. I've sent copies of my book to all the directors and the president of the Hall of Fame. And I recently got a letter from the president who told me he's going to read my book. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, let's give you the opportunity to promote this book because it is so well done. It's interesting to read. It reads well, but it also is packed full of argumentative background and statistics and rationale. And it's not just the 24 overlooked ball players that sort of are in your sort of top tier, but there's also a couple of dozen folks worthy of consideration. And I think some people, especially people who are baseball fans, would actually recognize some of those names as well.
Yeah, I tried to deal with many players who, might not have been the best 24, but then again, they might have been. I don't think any two people have ever submitted the identical ballot to the Hall of Fame for, any election. Everyone has different opinions. But my point was that there are really some great players out there. And I hope people will read this book and appreciate that. The book is available, on Amazon now. And it's called Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame by Stephen Greenis. And I would encourage people to take a look at it.
What do you think, in your heart of hearts, happens from here on out for this effort and baseball's still ongoing grappling with the history of the Negro Leagues and its memories and lauding?
What's sad to me is, other than the 2005 election, the Hall of Fame has really been, reluctant to be aggressive on this issue. I think to a certain extent they don't want to offend, the major league players who are in the hall and are an important part of the ceremony every year when they come back. But I think that's silly. When the 17 Negro Leaguers were elected in 2006, nobody said anything negative. Everybody, thought that was great. And I think if they really try to open the process, the public will appreciate it. And I think until they do it, it's really only a partial Hall of Fame. It should be a full Hall of Fame for all people who are entitled to membership.
Do you think that 17-member class was perceived perhaps as overdue tokenism versus, more systemic recalibration of the process?
I don't know. I do think that the 17 people who were elected warranted election. My problem is that many more do. And, there's a saying that the Hall of Fame is really reserved for the top 1% of all players. But if you look at the major league players, in fact, 1.5% of the players who've played Major League Baseball are in the Hall of Fame. The Negro League players in the Hall of Fame, even if you added the 24 that I argue should be in, that would bring the total to 59, that would be 0.7% of the Negro League players. So, statistically, we're nowhere near where we should be in terms of treating these guys equally and fairly. because these are great, great players.
Well, I'd love to stay in touch and hear how your, I wouldn't call it a crusade per se, but this is the evidence, if you will, Your Honor. I think of
I've said that before.
At least opening the door to a reconsideration, not only of the players and the other folks that you forcefully and in a well-researched way defend and argue should be in there, but also the process, right? It just feels to me that and again, I'm not the sort of saber nerd guy, right? But it seems like the process still hasn't been fully addressed. And it would also seem to me, and now I'm trying to get off descending my soapbox here, but it would almost seem to me that this is perhaps in the last number of decades, right, the most exquisite moment in time, given all that's been going on the last year plus in this country from various things, to actually address this, and it seems like an open door to actually do that.
I agree completely. I actually started writing this book 3 years ago, but the time is propitious. It's this is the right time for this type of opening to occur, and I think the Hall of Fame, if it recognizes it, will be lauded for that.
Well, look, I admire the scholarship for this, and I highly encourage anybody who considers themselves a baseball fan and just is intrigued in the Negro Leagues. Obviously, we've talked about some of the books and the media that can sort of get one more knowledgeable and more understanding of the generalities. And obviously, the museum in Kansas City is certainly a wonderful stop when people can travel again. But once you start scratching the surface and you get into some of the more particulars of this, I mean, you start to recognize that the Hall of Fame and baseball, organized baseball generally, is probably still a few, if not more than a few, steps behind when it comes to not only equality, but just the reality of understanding the fuller tableau of the sport, its history, and the role that the Negro Leagues and their players and their administrators and managers played. And that's part of the story of baseball, right? Not just as an era, right? But ongoing, right? Without it, right? You wouldn't have half of perhaps what we have today on all different fronts of baseball.
It's wonderful to celebrate Jackie Robinson, and he should be celebrated. But there's so much more to the story, and it's my passion that the story needs to be completed by honoring all the people who were right behind Jackie Robinson and were part of the world he came from.
All right, we'll leave it there, and we wish Stephen the best with the book and the case and the cause and the book you should get. It's called Negro Leaguers and the Hall of Fame, the case for inducting 24 overlooked ball players. It is published by our pals at McFarland, and it is kind of a misnomer, the title, because in addition to the 24 that Stephen kind of just thinks are locks, frankly, to be included in the Hall of Fame, there's at least, for every one of those, there's probably about 2 or 3 others that are worthy of further discussion, also included and discussed in this book. It's great. It's really good, and it's enlightening. There's some names that surprise that are in there, and there's some, frankly, just wonderful nicknames, just is worth the price of admission right there. And it adds just a whole nother layer of color to a great and continuingly fascinating story about that of the Negro Leagues. And it'll be interesting to watch, frankly, how the Hall of Fame not only reacts to this book, because it's a pretty good defense about how these players and these other folks associated with the play of the Negro Leagues should be included. There are great cases made here in this work, but just generally, right? It's one doesn't have to go too far outside of one's house to understand and listen to what's going on out there in the world, especially in this country, and the moment in time in which we're in. And lots of things going on, but clearly the timing perhaps could not be more exquisite to crowbar open finally and let more light in, shall we say, to the Hall of Fame and its ongoing ability to recognize and or include those from the Negro Leagues of yore. Let's see, what else? Our thanks, of course, to our pal Jerry Payne for his efforts this week, for helping us put our pieces together. We thank you, kind sir. And let's see, if you want to not only buy this book, well, why don't you buy this book through our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. There's a little link there on this episode. Just search up this episode with Stephen Greenis, and you will see a convenient link to the book. You'll be whisked away to Amazon. When you do buy any book or item through our website, of course, you'll give us a few shekels of love in the process. That helps keep our lights on and the heat going here, so we can keep more shows pumping out for you. We appreciate that if you do. Of course, if you don't, or you want to buy it at your local bookstore or whatever, just however you want to buy the stuff, just do it. We encourage you to support all of our great guests and their works. But if you happen to do it on our website, we appreciate it. And there's lots of other stuff on the site, including, by the way, the literary scores of other shows. Almost 200 now as we sort of near the end of this calendar year. And they're all there for you. All the great episodes. You can just search them up. There's a nice search bar. It's very convenient, very robust. You can download them. You can stream them. You can do whatever you want. Share them with your friends. You can also find our social media feeds there too, or just enter them directly into whatever manner that you follow in the apps or whatever. And that's, let's see, on Instagram, we're at Good Seats Still Available. Sorry, Good Seats Still Available. That's on Instagram, the full thing there. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. That's the more truncated version. On Facebook, there's a little page devoted to us as well. And of course, you can send us email if you'd like to. We're overdue in responding to all the great emails that we've got. Maybe we'll do a special mini episode to thank and to answer questions from our voluminous listener mail, shall we call it. Our email address, again, is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can also subscribe to our little weekly email newsletter. Just search up that on our website, and we'll get you a little head start on the week's proceedings a little ahead of time. If you want to know what's coming up. And I think that's it. Hang on to your hats, everybody. The next couple of weeks are going to be very interesting in our respective lives. So please stay safe. Make sure that you give yourself enough time to vote. And I don't know, just, do your best to get through. Take it day by day if you have to. I think we all are in that sort of boat together. And knock on wood, we'll be here for you next week with another, hopefully, fun-filled episode. Thanks for listening. Take care. And until next week, bye-bye.